International Journal of Health Policy and Management. Quality and speed are our culture and the keys to our success. Welcome to the audio summary section of the International Journal of Health Policy and Management.
In this video, I want to talk about a recent article we published on the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement and pose the question about whether it was actually a bad deal for public health. Now, the lack of progress on expanding the huge set of multilateral agreements reached in 1995 with the birth of the World Trade Organization led the world's rich countries, and notably the USA and the European Union, to start negotiating these WTO plus agreements with smaller nations or smaller groups of nations. And the TPP is one such agreement, involving 12 countries around the Pacific Rim. Some are tiny, like Brunei. Others are still economically small and developing, such as Vietnam. Others are high income and well established, like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. While two essentially dominate economically, and that's the United States and Japan. Now, the agreement is still to be ratified, and without these two economically dominant countries ratifying the trade deal, it will collapse completely. And much is going to depend on what final decision the U.S. makes as it goes through a transition in presidential power. Now, first, let's be clear on the real driver of this treaty, as the logos for the U.S. Trade Representative Office proudly proclaims. It's an agreement made in America. But as the Nobel economist Joe Stiglitz noted at a colloquium on the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement last April hosted by the University of Ottawa, it's not so much made in America as made by American transnational companies and the U.S. interest in writing the trade rules for the Asian Pacific region before China does. Now, over a 3-year period that included analysis of earlier leaked texts and then of the final publicly released treaty, we undertook a health impact assessment of the TPP. And in so doing, we were interested not only in the effect on pharmaceuticals due to expanded intellectual property rights, but also on health systems, health harmful commodities, food security, the public right to regulate, and how such agreements affect the larger economy, the environment, and employment, all of which can have impacts on health and health equity. Now, in this short video, I will touch briefly on just 3 topics: the right to regulate with reference to the spread of health harmful commodities, the investor-state dispute settlement chapter, also known as ISDS, and the economic benefits made about the TPP, since there is a presumption that greater trade and investment liberalization improves economic growth, which leads to new jobs and to trickle-down improvements in health. Now, first, regarding the spread of health harmful commodities. In developed TPP countries, this concern is largely irrelevant, as most of these markets are already saturated with tobacco products and obesogenic food items. But this is not the case for Vietnam, which only recently began to open itself to global trade in these commodities. At present, just over 1% of Vietnamese women smoke, and these are targets for the tobacco transnationals. And there's prior experience here. When South Korea opened its markets to tobacco transnationals, their market share zoomed from 3% to 42%, and female smoking rates increased 9-fold. We can expect similar health harmful trends in Vietnam. And this also applies to unhealthy foods. Vietnam got its first McDonald's in 2014, and 2 years later it has 8 of them. When it opened its markets to soft drinks, Coca-Cola and Pepsi surged in their market share, and the consumption of their sugar-sweetened beverages soared, even as other countries around the world are trying to impose tax measures to reduce the impacts of such products on childhood obesity. Now, the spread of health harmful commodities is facilitated at least in part by agreements such as the TPP, and that creates an even greater necessity for the right to regulate. And specifically for the right to regulate, our study was interested in what happened in the Sanitary and Phytosanitary Standards, or SPS, chapter of the TPP, which addresses food standards, and the Technical Barriers to Trade chapter, or TBT, as well as a brand new Regulatory Coherence chapter. Now, when it comes to the new regulatory coherence chapter, the health risks are fairly low, given that it's primarily a laundry list of good intentions and that it is excluded from any dispute settlement process. But it does impose a cumbersome set of new reporting procedures that could overburden developing country TPP members. And it also requires TPP governments to allow private corporate interests from any other TPP nation to participate in setting new regulations. Now, there were also some troubling changes in both the SPS and the TBT chapters when it comes to the matter of scientific evidence. Public health concerns with the SPS agreement actually go back to the World Trade Organization itself and reference to Codex as the major source of international standards related to food safety. The original intent of Codex was to set a minimum level of food protection. Countries were allowed to have tougher standards, but not lower ones. And the WTO's SPS agreement essentially switched this around so that the regulatory floor became the regulatory ceiling, which WTO members could not go above without providing scientific justification for having those standards. Now, the TPP adds new constraints to the WTO's SPS agreement, which leads with a permissive statement that states are able to implement higher protection, this is what the WTO says, and which also allows for minority scientific evidence to justify tougher standards. The TPP chapter on SPS leads differently with the importance of conformity. Moreover, the requirement for exceeding such standards shifts from a scientific justification to one based on documented and objective scientific evidence, and this has the potential to undermine execution of the precautionary principle. In many instances, such evidence is simply lacking, meaning that new public health regulations can't be imposed until a public health problem is definitively proven. What the TPP adds to the WTO's Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement is the requirement to ensure that standards don't create an unnecessary trade barrier before they are put in force. Now, there's no such obligation like this under the WTO's TBT chapter, and whether their new regulation creates an unnecessary trade barrier has first to go through a formal dispute settlement process. Moreover, and like the Regulatory Coherence chapter, the TBT chapter in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement opens the door for transnational corporations to have a say in how, for example, a country like Canada might establish new food regulations related to the control of heart disease, diabetes, or obesity. So there are definitely some concerns with both the SPS and the TBT chapters in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement as they continue to impose more constraints on governments' right to regulate and policy make. But the really big concern with the TPP and other new regional trade agreements is with the ISDS provisions, the Investor-State Dispute Settlement provisions, which allow private foreign investors to directly sue governments. First, in this slide, we can see the explosion in these claims based on treaties that were first introduced in the 1980s, but which only really took off in the 1990s. It took a while for foreign investors to see what lay embedded in these treaties, and they were partly prompted to do so by investment lawyers themselves. When foreign investors sue governments for regulations that they think have affected the present and future value of their investments, the dispute is heard in a secret panel of 3 investment lawyers, whose decisions are final with no appeal, and where there are known conflict of interest between the lawyers hearing the disputes and the foreign corporations suing governments. What's more, as the number of these disputes rose, so did the value of financial awards to foreign investors given out by the tribunals. The implications for public health rest primarily on the nature of the claims made by investors, many of which have direct or indirect health impacts. Some disputes, for example, have successfully challenged governments' decisions to reverse healthcare privatization schemes, and many disputes have been over environmental regulations that indirectly affect health. Now, many TPP governments have argued that they've actually protected governments' health and other regulatory policy space, and they cite in particular this article in the ISDS chapter as an example, so we really shouldn't worry. And this statement, at first read, seems really quite reasonable. But let's wait a minute and look at the 5 little italicized words in this agreement, which essentially negates the supposed protection, since they mean that governments can regulate in the public interest, but only if they comply with all of the other obligations in the investment chapter. So translation, not really a right to regulate at all. Now finally, we have the economic claims made for treaties like the TPP. Since neoclassical economics holds that increased international trade is good for the economy, good for employment and growth, good for trickle-down health. But is it really? Let's first consider the global shifts in our economy that have occurred since our global liberalization period started in the 1980s. And as you can see here, there's been an enormous erosion in the share of economic wealth going to labor versus that which is going to capital. This is what has led to a rampaging inequality in global wealth that has been so severe that it's now attracting the attention of the UN General Assembly, the World Bank, the IMF, and almost every other multilateral agency. Now, the TPP has been described as a gold-plated treaty with huge economic opportunities. But of 7 econometric studies of the TPP, the most optimistic ones show only modest gains for almost all TPP countries, an average of about 0.5% increase in GDP by 2025. All but one of these models use something called computable general equilibrium, which assumes no change in employment rates, equal or improving income distribution, and no cost to governments. Yet this is simply not what happens in the real world, where employment rates are affected, often negatively, income becomes more unequal, and there are direct and indirect public costs. If we consider Canada, where the government recently estimated that our GDP would increase by a whopping 0.1% by 2040, which is a rather long time to wait for a negligible gain that's really little more than a rounding error, and also that our economy would gain by 2040 around $4 billion. Meanwhile, the Canadian government has already guaranteed over $5 billion in compensation for higher drug costs and lost employment or earning in our auto industry and some of our agricultural sectors. Only one econometric model, the UN Global Policy Model, does not make these same patently ridiculous assumptions about employment and income gains. And what it found was a negligible increase for TPP developing countries, a net loss in GDP for the TPP high-income countries, and an overall loss in employment of 650,000 jobs. Who will benefit? The transnational corporations involved in such trade and investment. And so far there's only been one study that's looked at income gains to a fully realized TPP using American data, which finds that most U.S. workers will will experience a loss in their income, while the top 1% once again will gain an increase. Now this has led our own health impact study to conclude with 2 questions. Why should we give up so much for so little? And what exactly is or should be the purpose of our new 21st century trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement? And then we suggest, if we cannot have all 12 countries agree to reopen the agreement to make it fit for the 21st century rather than being a relic of the expired 20th century, then it may be best simply to reject it and start over again. And here I would just like to acknowledge some of the many people who contributed in one way or another to our health impact assessment. Thank you.